if we're going to endure in pastoral ministry, not only do we have to watch ourselves spiritually, but also physically. We have to make it. We have to live long enough to endure. You've had some physical challenges over the years. Talk about those a little bit and about what the Lord's taught you through that.
Yeah, so my first 5 years at our church, 3 different efforts to get me fired, a lot of conflict, a lot of stress. There were threats of violence towards me at different times. And the 5 years of accumulating that and being young and not aware of how to deal with it. I was in my early 30s at the end of that 5 years, and and my body just started breaking down. The physical manifestations of that stress, that emotional, mental, spiritual stress that I was under. And I had a heart issue that developed. I still have to deal with to this day. It just kind of broke me. And it was that pressed me to realize I actually have to physically care for myself if I want to do this a long time, that there's emotional and spiritual mental stress of being a pastor that actually shows up in your body. And no one really told me that. I had to experience that on my own. And it's been a road to try to figure out then what does that look like? How do you physically care for yourself? But what I would love is if pastors would just listen to us and trust that's true, instead of them waiting till their body breaks down or they sleep 4 hours a night because they want to get all ahead of all this work and whatever, not get enough sleep, not eat well, and those kind of things. But you've also had physical challenges that come from the stress of ministry as well.
Yeah, sometimes it's pressing your body farther than it can go, and sometimes it's ignoring warning signs along the way. But if you press your body beyond what it's naturally able to do, you'll suffer the consequences of it. It's cause and effect, and the Lord may sustain you for some season of time, but eventually you'll reap what you're sowing. Take that biblical principle and apply it in this way. You'll reap what you sow, and I've seen the effects of that. And what I learned in it, as much as anything, is the rhythms of the way God has made the human body to function. Yeah. That He made us to work and rest. That's a part of how we are, not just to work and work, but to work and rest. And the pastor's no exception to that. And reminding us of our frailty is a big instrument of His grace in our lives to teach us lots of other things about the end of ourselves and why we have to rely on Him and why we can't do this all by ourselves. But physically, often He'll press us to the point that we can't go on physically to get our attention. And He's certainly done that in my life. And again, it's about that rhythm, work and rest.
There's a deception I see a lot of younger guys with tons of energy fall into, 20s and 30s, and they're pastoring and burning candle at both ends. They think, well, because I can do this now, that it's okay for me to do this. And, in the work we do here at Practical Shepherding, we find pastors in their 40s and 50s paying some real price because they weren't mindful in their 20s and 30s. And by the way, the Puritans wrote that way. You can find Puritans that wrote about how they're engaging in physical suffering in their 40s and 50s because of the way they lived their life in their 20s and 30s. So this is not an old rule, or this is not a new rule. This is an old rule that we need to apply and realize. We often just ignore the fact that what does it mean to be a holistic human being created in the image of God? And we disassociate the physical from the emotional and the mental and the spiritual. And that's ironic for pastors to do. So this isn't just for our own personal care, for us to try to care for people in our church and to understand that this actually is a principle that's rooted in us being created in the image of God, that the physical manifestations of our body a lot of times are reflective of what's going on in the inner soul.
That's right. And let's push back on the other side too, because while we're not to work and work, we're to work and rest. We're also not supposed to rest and rest, which also can be equally detrimental to the body. And it may show up in different ways, but the Lord's called us to work. And so we're not advocating for any sort of laziness here. What we're saying is that there ought to be a rhythm in which a man does what he can do, of course, strengthened by the Lord to do that. But then he rests appropriately. And there's a laziness that can be in pastoral ministry as well.
Certainly. Yeah, to spend and be spent is the calling. Like, don't be a pastor if you're not going to just give your life to it, and you can't do this halfway. And that's the thing. Most pastors that I know go really hard in that way. But you know what? There are some that battle laziness. In fact, it's important to highlight that. And the laziness shows up not just in their job, but how they physically care for their bodies when you're talking about exercise and other things like that. So the balanced approach and the holistic approach of physical care is how we need to try to balance our entire lives, how to have a long ministry for sure.